It had been one of those weeks. The kind where the endless meetings, deadlines, and demands never seemed to stop. My mind was a blur of tasks. My body a bit worn down from the constant rush of things. All I wanted now was a moment of peace. A chance to unwind and escape the grind for just a few hours. I boarded the flight, looking forward to the quiet solitude of my first-class seat, ready to sink into the plush chair, sip some champagne, and let the gentle hum of the plane lull me into a well-deserved rest. The moment I stepped onto the plane, the stress of the past few days began to melt away. The soft lighting of the cabin, the comfort of my seat, it was everything I needed. I stowed my carry-on in the overhead bin, took a deep breath, and settled into the soft leather of the seat. As I clicked my seatbelt in place, I allowed myself a rare moment of relaxation, knowing that for the next few hours, I could finally switch off. But before I could even fully adjust, I heard a sharp voice cut through the calm of the cabin. The sound was jarring, impossible to ignore. "Excuse me. You're in my seat." I blinked, disoriented, not quite sure I heard right. Surely, I hadn't just boarded a flight where my moment of peace would be immediately interrupted. But there she was. A woman in an oversized designer coat, her heels clicking across the floor like an alarm clock ringing in the silence. It was Karen, and she was about to turn my well-earned escape into something I never could have imagined. The moment Karen stepped onto the plane, the atmosphere shifted. She was draped in an oversized designer coat, her sunglasses perched on top of her head like a crown, and she strutted down the aisle as if she were the center of attention. Her heels clicked against the floor, echoing through the cabin as she dragged her wheeled suitcase behind her, with a force that made it clear she was on a mission. She had no interest in settling into her assigned seat, and instead, she stopped in front of a first-class seat, mine. I had barely gotten comfortable, adjusting my seatbelt and taking a sip from my glass of champagne, when I heard her voice. "Excuse me. You're in my seat," she said, a tone of unmistakable entitlement dripping from every word. I glanced up at her, not sure if I had heard correctly. "Sorry, I think you're mistaken. This is my seat," I replied calmly, showing her my boarding pass, which clearly indicated 4A. Her face twisted with irritation, and she crossed her arms, tapping her foot impatiently. No, this is my seat. I fly this route all the time, and I always sit here," Karen insisted, her voice rising. I sighed, trying to remain patient. "I have a confirmed ticket for this seat. You must be in the wrong spot." Karen's eyes narrowed, and she dramatically turned toward the flight attendant, who had been quietly observing the scene unfold. "Excuse me, but this man is in my seat," she announced loudly. Her voice now dripped with exaggerated sweetness, trying to sway the flight attendant to her side. The flight attendant, a professional with years of experience, responded with a calm smile. "Ma'am, may I see your boarding pass?" she asked politely. Karen pulled a crumpled boarding pass out of her bag, throwing it at the attendant with a huff. "Here," she snapped. "But there must be some mistake. I always sit in first class, and I'm certainly not sitting in economy." The flight attendant took a moment to glance at the boarding pass before looking up at Karen. "Ma'am, your seat is actually 23B in economy," she said gently, glancing at me with a slight nod. "This seat, 4A, is assigned to this gentleman." A pause. The silence between us was thick, charged with unspoken tension. Karen's face turned bright red with disbelief, as if she couldn't comprehend the truth. "No, that's impossible," she nearly shouted. "I always sit in first class. There must be some mistake in the system." She was on the edge of a full-blown meltdown, and I could already tell she wasn't going to back down easily. Her tantrum was just beginning. Karen wasn't finished. Her voice, now louder and more frantic, sliced through the tension in the cabin. "I paid for first class. I should be sitting here, not in some cramped economy seat. Do you know who I am? Her hands waved dramatically as if she were expecting a round of applause. I have a huge following on social media. You don't want to mess with me. I could feel the collective eye rolls of the other passengers. But Karen didn't seem to notice. She turned to the flight attendant. Her tone now smooth and calculated. Almost sugary sweet. "Excuse me," she said. "But there must be a mistake. I'm a very well-known social media influencer. I have over 100,000 followers on Facebook. That's a huge audience. And I'm going to make sure they all know how badly your airline is treating me." The flight attendant, unmoved, remained calm. "Ma'am, I understand you're upset. But the seat assignments are final. If you'd like, I can check if there's an upgrade available for purchase." Karen's eyes narrowed. "Don't bother," she snapped, her voice turning cold. "I shouldn't have to pay for an upgrade when I'm basically giving this airline free marketing. I've recommended this airline to my followers countless times. Now, if you don't let me have this seat, I'll make sure everyone knows just how terrible you treat your loyal customers." She pulled out her phone, tapping away furiously at the screen. Her voice stripped with self-importance as she continued. "You have no idea what kind of damage I can do. I can ruin your reputation in minutes. A few posts, and people will be boycotting this airline left and right." A few passengers exchanged uncomfortable glances, clearly frustrated by the scene unfolding in front of them. I could feel that tension rising. Karen's attempt to leverage her so-called influence had clearly been rehearsed. She was trying to intimidate the flight attendants into giving in. But they weren't budging. The flight attendant, still composed, responded firmly. "We encourage passengers to share their experiences. But our policies are clear. If you continue to cause a disturbance, I will have to ask you to take your assigned seat." Karen scoffed, her fingers still flying across her phone. "This is ridiculous," she shouted, glaring at the attendant. "You're going to regret this. I have hundreds of thousands of people who follow my every word. Trust me. They're going to hear about this. You don't want to mess with me." But the flight attendant's patience never wavered. "Ma'am, if you continue disturbing other passengers, I will have to call security." Security? That seemed to be the tipping point for Karen. She froze for a moment, as if the gravity of the situation had just sunk in. She glanced back at me, then at the flight attendants. Realizing her threats weren't working, instead of backing down, she decided to escalate further. "You think you can intimidate me?" she sneered, still clutching her phone like a weapon. "I'm not leaving. I'll make sure this goes viral. You'll see what happens when I post this." But no one was intimidated. The flight attendants stood their ground, and the passengers watched. Some amused, others incredulous. Karen's social media following was now her last card, and it was quickly losing power. As Karen stood there, her frustration bubbling over, she clearly realized that her threats weren't working. Her phone screen lit up, and with a dramatic sigh, she shifted her stance, as if she had just discovered a new weapon in her arsenal. "Fine," she said, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "You don't seem to understand who you're dealing with. Watch what happens next." Without warning, she raised her phone, switching on the camera with a flourish. "Hey, everyone," she said in a voice that was almost theatrical, her gaze sweeping over the flight attendants, the passengers, and me. "I just want to share what's happening to me right now. This airline is completely mistreating me. I'm a loyal customer. And look how they're treating me. They won't let me sit in my rightful seat in first class, even though I paid for it." She panned the camera toward the flight attendants, now standing side by side with neutral expressions, and then zoomed in on me. "This man," she continued, her voice rising, "refuses to move and give up his seat for me. Can you believe that? I'm in pain. I need this seat due to my medical condition. But these people, this airline, they just don't care." She held the camera out toward the cabin, flashing an exaggerated, pained expression. Her fingers trembled slightly, but she made sure to angle the shot to show herself in the best possible light, all while keeping the tension alive. I have hundreds of thousands of followers. You know, if this isn't handled, the world is going to know just how awful this airline is. But as Karen's performance continued, it quickly became evident that her carefully crafted narrative was unraveling. Passengers in the first-class cabin, initially watching her with curiosity, were beginning to recognize her. "Wait," one of them muttered, leaning over to his companion. "Isn't she the one who got banned from that hotel last year for causing a scene over a continental breakfast?" The woman sitting 2 rows ahead nodded. "Yeah. I remember seeing her on social media. She went viral for throwing a fit about not getting what she wanted." A few more whispers filled the air, and Karen's smug expression faltered for a moment. The stream of sympathy she had been expecting wasn't coming. Instead, a few snickers echoed through the cabin. Her viewers were dropping, and the comments section of her live stream reflected that. "This is ridiculous. We've seen you do this before. You're not fooling anyone." The comments flooded in with sarcasm and ridicule, shattering her illusion of being the victim. Her confidence wavered as the reality of her dwindling audience sank in. She glanced at her phone, her eyes widening when she saw how few people were watching. "What the hell?" she muttered under her breath, her tone turning defensive. "Why is nobody watching?" A few more passengers leaned in, their phones in hand, chuckling to themselves as they scrolled through her past viral incidents. "Oh, I remember this one," one man said aloud, referencing her infamous hotel meltdown. "She's really not the victim here, is she?" Karen's face went red, and she quickly turned off the live stream. Her entire narrative of being mistreated was falling apart before her eyes. The flight attendants, still calm, exchanged a look, clearly aware that Karen's attempt to manipulate the situation had failed. The passengers were no longer on her side, and her so-called influence had crumbled. The damage was done, her desperate bid for attention had backfired. It was clear that Karen's antics weren't going to stop. The flight attendants, ever composed, exchanged a brief glance, then turned to face her with unflinching professionalism. Karen, still seething with outrage, continued to rant about her rights and how she was being treated like a criminal. But the moment she raised her voice again, the captain, who had been quietly observing from the cockpit, appeared at the front of the cabin. The air seemed to thicken with tension as the captain's presence commanded attention. He was tall, his uniform sharp, with golden stripes gleaming on his sleeves, radiating authority. Karen's bravado faltered slightly, but she quickly composed herself, as though she still believed she could get away with her tantrum. The captain didn't waste time with pleasantries. "Ma'am," the captain began, his voice calm but firm, "I understand you're upset, but this behavior is unacceptable. You've been informed that you are seated in economy, not first class. This is causing a disruption to the other passengers and delaying the flight." Karen's face twisted, disbelief written all over her features. "You're not listening to me," she screeched. "I have rights. I paid for a first-class seat. This is ridiculous. I need this seat, or you'll regret it. You don't know who I am." The captain didn't flinch. "I'm afraid your seat is confirmed in economy. Ma'am, if you continue to refuse to comply, we will have no choice but to remove you from the flight." The flight attendants, now standing behind the captain, looked at each other, their expressions firm. Karen's whole demeanor shifted slightly. She seemed to realize that she wasn't going to win this battle. But instead of backing down, she doubled down. "You can't do this," she snapped, her voice rising again. "You'll regret it. I'll make sure your airline gets bad press. You'll see what happens when I post about this." Her empty threats hung in the air, but the captain wasn't swayed. "This is your final warning," he said, his voice steely. "Take your assigned seat or we will call security." A murmur ran through the cabin. Passengers were shifting in their seats, some casting glances at each other. clearly ready for the situation to be resolved. And then, as if on cue, the sound of footsteps echoed down the aisle. 2 uniformed security officers appeared at the entrance of the first-class cabin. One officer, a tall woman with a calm but firm demeanor, stepped forward. "We've been informed that there's a passenger refusing to comply with flight crew instructions," she said, her voice carrying authority. Karen's face drained of color. This was no longer a confrontation with flight attendants, this was serious. She began to sputter, trying to deflect the situation. "Wait. I'm not doing anything wrong. I just need to sit here. I have medical conditions. You can't make me sit back there with them." But the officers weren't buying it. "Ma'am," the second officer said, his tone firm, "if you do not comply with crew instructions, you will be removed from this flight." The tension in the cabin was palpable as Karen's options narrowed. She looked between the officers and the captain, her breathing shallow. The flight attendants stood silently, unwavering, realizing she had no ground left to stand on. Karen opened her mouth to argue again, but the words never came. Instead, she stared at the security officers in disbelief as they moved forward, preparing to escort her off the plane. "Ma'am," one officer said, stepping closer, "please come with us." At this point, Karen's world started to collapse. Her protests grew more frantic as the officers began to move toward her. She reached out, grabbing the seat in front of her in a last-ditch attempt to stay put. "No, I'm not leaving," she screamed, her hands trembling. But the security officers were unfazed. They gently but firmly took hold of her arms, guiding her toward the aisle. The whole cabin watched in stunned silence, some passengers whispering, others pulling out their phones to record. The sound of Karen's outraged sobs filled the air as she was dragged away, her body shaking with fury. As she was led down the aisle, the passengers' eyes followed her every move. Some couldn't hold back their laughter. Others exchanged looks of disbelief. A few even applauded as Karen was escorted off the plane, her tantrum having spiraled so completely out of control. The cabin door closed behind her with a loud, final click. The flight attendants let out a collective sigh of relief, and the captain turned to the passengers, nodding toward the cockpit. "Thank you for your patience," he said, his voice still calm but carrying an undertone of relief. The moment the door to the plane sealed shut, there was a wave of relief that rippled through the cabin. People began to relax, some chuckling, others shaking their heads in disbelief. As the flight crew got back to their duties, I couldn't help but lean back in my seat and let out a deep breath. Finally, the flight could resume. But Karen, she would be the story of the flight. And her reputation? Well, that was already being torn apart. As the plane finally took off, the cabin began to relax. But the atmosphere was still buzzing with the aftermath of Karen's meltdown. I settled into my seat, hoping to put the whole incident behind me. But it was impossible to ignore. The quiet hum of the airplane was interrupted by the incessant tapping of phone screens. Passengers who had witnessed the drama unfolding began to share their thoughts and videos on social media. And within minutes, Karen's story was already being picked apart in real time. A few rows behind me, a man leaned over to his wife, showing her his phone. "Look at this," he said, holding up the video of Karen's hysterical outburst. "She's going viral, only not in the way she planned." On Twitter, the hashtags began to flood in, hashtag Karen gets dragged off, hashtag airline Karen, and hashtag entitled passenger. The viral videos were everywhere, showing Karen shouting, demanding special treatment, and finally being dragged off the plane by security. The comments were ruthless. "She literally threw a fit over a seat she didn't pay for." One comment read, "Her meltdown is priceless." Another wrote, "She's lucky the airline even let her fly again, let alone keep her account active." Hashtag by Karen. Karen, still oblivious to the growing storm, decided to take action. She quickly opened her phone, feverishly typing away. She was trying to spin the narrative, playing the victim card once more. I was humiliated today by this airline. They mistreated me and refused to accommodate my needs. I'm so upset. And this is the kind of service you get when you fly with them. I have over 100,000 followers. And I will make sure the world knows about this injustice. But as she hit post, the damage was already done. The videos circulating on social media had already exposed the truth. Passengers from the flight were commenting, tearing apart her version of events. One person wrote, "She was yelling at the crew and causing a scene. No wonder she got escorted off the plane. She didn't even have a first-class ticket." Even worse, someone posted a clip of her live stream, where her audience could see the overwhelming support for the airline and the disgust directed toward Karen. Her attempt at garnering sympathy turned into an all-out spectacle. A few hours later, the airline released an official statement: "We take passenger safety and professionalism seriously." The individual involved in the incident was not only disruptive but also in violation of airline policy. "We do not tolerate behavior that endangers the experience of other passengers." The moment Karen saw the statement, her confidence cracked. She refreshed her feed and saw the hashtags exploding. The airline was calling her out. And it wasn't just a slap on the wrist. Her entire post was buried beneath the sea of critical comments from people who had seen the truth. And then, she saw the tweet that destroyed what was left of her reputation. "Karen has been permanently blacklisted from this airline and will be banned from future flights. #Goodbye Karen." Panicked, Karen quickly turned to direct messages. She reached out to passengers who had witnessed her tantrum, desperate for any sort of support. "Please. You don't understand." She messaged one. "I was just stressed out. Can you help me make this go away? Maybe post something saying it wasn't as bad as it looked. I don't want my career to be ruined over one mistake." But it was too late. One by one, the messages were ignored or replied to with sarcastic comments. A woman who had witnessed the entire incident sent a message back: "Your behavior was awful. Karen. You really should have thought about the consequences before you threw that fit. Sorry. I can't help you." The inevitable backlash continued. And as Karen's desperation grew, her influence dwindled. Her once pristine social media accounts began to unravel. She deleted her posts. But the damage was irreversible. Screenshots had already gone viral. Every outrageous claim, every attempt to manipulate the situation, was now cemented in the public eye. She had tried to use her social media following to intimidate the airline and passengers. But instead, she had sealed her own downfall. Her once thriving career as an influencer was crumbling before her eyes. Sponsors and brands began to distance themselves. And soon, her name became synonymous with entitlement and self-sabotage. Her posts vanished. Her followers unfollowed. And the internet did what it does best: it never forgets. Karen was now a living meme. An example of how unchecked entitlement can have disastrous consequences. As her notifications continued to blow up with ridicule, Karen realized too late that she had lost everything. The price of her tantrum wasn't just a seat on a plane, it was her career, her reputation, and any remaining credibility she had left.